Good morning, scholars. Today is Tuesday, April 7th. Really impressed with the work you did yesterday on multiplying decimals. As always, want to start with some shout outs for the 100% Club. Excited to see a lot more representation from both UNC and Duke. In fact, it was a three-way tie in terms of number of scholars. So shout outs to from UNC, Lyric, Dillery, Emmanuel, Tenbeat, and Jaden. Really nice work, all 100% on multiplying decimals yesterday. Representing from SCU, we had Nevaeh, Anira, Alejandro, Aiden. Aiden, I don't think you've missed a single 100% shout out club. You've been there every single day. And Zach, nice work. And Duke, your biggest representation yet. Nice work. Larry, Ulidi, Camila, Diami, and Tatiana. Really nice work. Excited to see an even representation from the classes. Exciting news is that we are doing really, really well with multiplying decimals. Today, things are going to get a little bit more tricky. We're actually moving on to dividing decimals. Pretty fun stuff. We're going to start this morning with a warm-up. Make sure you have your blank white paper ready to go. We're going to go kind of way back to something that we worked on all the way back in Unit 2, way back when in September. And let's take a look at some of these numbers, and we're just reminding ourselves how many tenths and how many hundredths are in each of these numbers. So let's try the first one together. You don't need to copy down all of these words. You can just find some room on your paper to fill in the answers. So if we're taking a look at 83 hundredths, I want to know how many tenths and how many hundredths. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look in the tenths place to see how many tenths we have. And in 83 hundredths, I actually have 8 tenths. And how many hundredths? We have 3 hundredths. All right, hopefully not too tricky. I want you to try this next warm-up one on your own. 46 hundredths is how many tenths and how many hundredths. Go ahead, find some room on your paper to fill it in. All right, very nice work. You are exactly correct. 46 hundredths does have 4 tenths and 6 hundredths. All right, now it's going to get just a little bit trickier. Looking at our next example, now I have 1 whole. So I don't actually have anything in the tenths place, but I know there's still some tenths in there. Just like when we want to know, well, how many ones are in the number 10, we know that actually there's 10 ones in 10 or 110. The number 1, does anyone know how many tenths are in 1 whole? That's exactly right. There are 10 tenths in 1 whole. If we were to draw out our 10 tenths sticks, it would in fact make 1 whole. So if there are 10 tenths in 1 whole, how many tenths are in 3 wholes? I know there's going to be more than 10 tenths. Go ahead and write it down when you know. Nice work. There are, in fact, 30 tenths in 3 wholes. If I want to just double check that with a picture, I can draw out 1 whole. I could split that into tenths. And 10 tenths makes up 1 whole. I can think of this as like my pan of brownies. I have 1 whole pan of brownies. I cut them into pieces. Each piece was 1/10. And if I have 10 tenths, it makes up 1 whole. So now if I have 3 wholes, and I want to know how many tenths that is, well, I'm going to split each one into tenths. Again, I like to think of this as brownies. Here's my 3 whole pans of brownies, and I cut each one into pieces that are 1/10. So I have 10 tenths in each hole for a total of 10, 20, 30 tenths in 3 holes. All right, for the most challenging piece yet, how many tenths are in 3 and 2 tenths? Try this one on your own. You could draw a picture. You can use what we already know. How many tenths are in 3 and 2 tenths? Nice work. I see a lot of correct answers. So we already know that 3 holes has 30 tenths. And then how many tenths in 2 tenths? Well, 2 tenths just has 2 tenths. And so there's a total of 32 tenths in 3 holes and 2 tenths. I can double check that by drawing it out. I'm going to draw my 3 holes. Splitting them into tenths. And then I need 2 additional tenths. So if I could count them all up, 10, 20, 30, 31, 32. There is a total of 32 tenths in 3 holes and 2 tenths. Today, as we begin learning how to divide decimals, we are going to be looking at how many tenths or how many hundredths are in a certain number, and that's going to help us divide. So we'll keep this in mind as we move on. We are going to look at 3 problems together. Make sure you have room on your scrap paper. Problem number 1 that we're going to solve today, first decimal division problem, I think of the whole year. Go ahead and write it down with me. The first problem that we are going to solve is 7 divided by 1/10. All right, make sure you have that written on your paper. 7 divided by 1/10. The very first thing that we are going to do is we are going to rewrite it as a fraction. We are really, really comfortable using fractions. Now, it's easy for me to turn this into a fraction because we were doing this when we were multiplying. And when I say it, it sounds exactly like what the fraction is. 7 divided by 1/10 is the same as 7 divided by 1/10. All right, so I've rewritten it as a fraction. Now, what is this actually asking? Well, this is asking how many tenths are in that number 7. Just like earlier when we were asking ourselves how many tenths are in 83 hundredths, or how many tenths are in 1 whole, or how many tenths are in 3 wholes. Now I just want to know how many tenths are in 7 wholes. So I'm going to actually just write that question down just to remind myself this is asking how many tenths in 7 wholes. You should write it down as well. Always good to just have this in your notes. This is truly asking how many tenths are in 7 wholes. All right. So let's go back to what we definitely know about 1 whole. I want to remind myself how many tenths are in 1 whole. So write this out with me. There are blank tenths in 1 whole. Okay, how many tenths are in 1 whole? Well, we solved this a second ago. I also know if we think about equivalent fractions to 1, I need the numerator to be the same as the denominator. How many tenths make up a whole? Well, I need all 10 tenths to be filled in to make up that whole. If I think about, again, my pan of brownies, if it was cut into tenths, how many tenths does it take to fill up the whole? Well, it takes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It takes all 10 tenths to make one whole. So let's fill that in. There are 10 tenths in a whole. But I'm not done because this problem wants to know how many tenths are in 7 wholes. So let's go ahead and write out a statement for that. There are blank tenths in 7 wholes. All right. Now, I can draw it out, and I will draw it out in a second just to prove my thinking, but let's see if we can figure this out even without a picture. If there are 10 tenths in one whole, if I were to have 7 wholes, how many tenths would that be? Well, 10 tenths in one whole means 70 tenths in 7 wholes. Let's prove that by drawing it out. I'm now going to draw out my 7 wholes. I'm going to split each one into tenths. You're doing this on your paper along with me. I think the easiest way to do tenths is to do fifths and then cut those in half. It's hard for me to fit 10 all in a row. All right, so now I have all 7 of my wholes broken into tenths. I don't need to count by ones. I can count by tens. We have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, and 70. All right, so I did prove that there are 70 tenths in 7 wholes. So my answer to this problem, 7 divided by 1/10, is actually 70. That makes sense that my answer got bigger because I know when I divide by a fraction or a decimal, my answer is actually getting bigger. I'm taking something and I'm splitting it up into smaller pieces, and therefore I have more pieces. Let's just review the steps that we just did. The first thing that we did after looking at our division problem with a decimal is we wrote it as a fraction. If you want to add this to your notes so you have these steps, the first thing we did is we wrote as a fraction. And we asked ourselves, how many tenths in 7 wholes? Then we compared it to how many tenths we know are in 1 whole. So we just set up this kind of proportion right here where we can ask ourselves, well, if there are 7 tenths in 1 whole, we know how many tenths are in 7 wholes. So I can just call this comparing to 1 whole. If I ever forget how many of a fraction are in a whole, I can draw it out. I know all of them need to be shaded in for it to be a whole. And so that's how I knew that there were 10 tenths in 1 whole. Once I compared it to 1 whole, it made it easy for me to figure out how many tenths were in 7 wholes. And then I double checked with a picture. So here we just proved it or double checked with a picture. All right, let's try another one. I'm going to draw a line, find some of my paper. Let's go through these same steps. This one's going to get a little bit trickier. In our next example, go ahead and write down this division problem along with me. We're going to be dividing, really tricky, 7 4/10 divided by 1/10. All right. Now we're getting really fancy. We are now not just dividing a whole number by a decimal, we're actually dividing a decimal by a decimal as we get you guys ready for 6th grade. All right, let's go back and look at our steps. You have these written down. The first thing that I want to do is I want to rewrite it as a fraction. Now, do not get tricked. I am not going to write both of my numbers as a fraction. I'm only going to rewrite my second number or my divisor as a fraction. So rewrite it along with me. We're going to keep this as 7 4/10 divided by, and here I'm going to be rewriting my divisor. If I forget that word, I can just label that the number we're dividing by is our divisor. I'm going to rewrite this as a fraction. All right, so when I say it, it pretty much tells me the fraction. 1/10, 1/10. All right, 7 4/10 divided by 1/10, which I know is just asking how many tenths are in 7 4/10. Okay, let's go ahead and compare it to a whole. So write along with me. There are blank tenths in one whole. That should be easy breezy. We should already have that filled out. We know that there are 10 tenths in one whole. So now I need to figure out, okay, I don't have one whole. I have 7 wholes. So there are 10 tenths in one whole. There are blank tenths in 7 wholes. Go ahead and fill this one out yourself. We should know exactly how many tenths are in those 7 wholes. Perfect. There are 70 tenths in 7 wholes. We already proved that in the last one. Thus, I now know if there's 10 tenths in one whole, there must be 70 tenths in 7 wholes. But I'm not done because I don't just have 7 tenths. I don't just have 7 wholes. I also have 4 tenths. So I also need to know how many tenths are in 4 tenths. It almost sounds like a trick question, and it almost is because this should be the easiest part. How many tenths in 4 tenths? Well, there are, you should be writing this along with me, there are blank tenths in 4 tenths. How many tenths in 4 tenths? The answer is right there for us. There are 4 tenths in 4 tenths. This is one of those questions where the answer is almost given away, and it almost seems harder than it is because we think, wait a second, it can't be that easy, but it is. How many tenths in 4 tenths? Well, there are 4 tenths in 4 tenths. So now I need to figure out, well, how many tenths are in 7 4 tenths? So here I just need to do a little bit of adding. 7 wholes and 4 tenths together equals 7 4 tenths. So 70 4 tenths equals 74. And so our answer to this question of 7 4 tenths divided by 1/10 is 74. You may be beginning to notice some kind of a pattern with the decimal point. Huge shout out if you are. That's going to come into play a little bit more tomorrow. Right now, we're really focusing on how many tenths are in a number to make sure we truly understand where this is coming from. Let's draw this out just to prove it. Remember that my question is how many tenths are in 7 4 tenths. So let's draw out our 7 wholes. And then I need 4 additional tenths. All right, let's go ahead and split up our 7 wholes into tenths. Plus we have our 4 additional tenths. Now let's count. Let's count by tens. How many do we have? 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 71, 72, 73, 74. So there are 74 tenths that fit in there. So 7 and 4 tenths divided by 1 tenth gives me an answer of 74. Again, I'm noticing that my answer got bigger. That makes sense. We already know that when we take a number and we divide it by a decimal or a fraction, a number smaller than 1, our answer is going to get larger. All right, one more we're going to try together. Go ahead and draw a line in your paper, or if you've run out of room, go ahead and find some more room. All right. So the last problem that we're going to try, go ahead and write it down along with me. Now we're going to try 7 divided by 100. All right, I'm going back to my notes to look at my very first step. First thing I need to do is rewrite it as a fraction. Go ahead and write it as a fraction. The nice thing about decimals is when you say them out loud, it gives you the fraction. So I know exactly how to write it. This is one of those things as you're working at home, don't be shy about saying it out loud. Instead of looking at it and thinking 7 divided by 0.01, just say out loud to yourself, 7 divided by 100. Oh yeah, that's exactly the same as 7 divided by 100. All right, now I need to compare it to 1 whole. So I'm going to write it out. There are blank, but now I'm no longer talking about tenths. Now I'm talking about hundredths. So I need to know there are blank hundredths in 1 whole, because this will help me to figure out there are blank hundredths in 7 wholes. All right, this one's a little trickier, but I want to see if you can try it on your own. Don't get tricked. There were 10 tenths. There were 10 tenths in 1 whole, but there's not 10 hundredths in 1 whole. How many hundredths are in that whole? If you need to think about your pan of brownies, if you're now dividing that pan of brownies into hundredths, maybe you have to share it with 100 people. So clearly not everyone gets as big of a piece of brownie, but how many hundredths go in that whole? And then how many hundredths are in the 7 wholes? Take 30 seconds to try it on your own. Okay, let's check in and see what we got. There are, you guys are exactly right. There's 100 hundredths in 1 whole, 10 tenths, 100 hundredths, which means there are 700 hundredths in 7 wholes. All right, so we could double check this. We put our 100 hundredths in 1 whole. If I wanted to draw out 7 wholes, and split each one into hundredths by drawing 10 lines down and 10 lines across. Let's count. I know there's 100 hundredths in 1 whole. So we have 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, 700. So our answer to 7 divided by 100 is in fact 700. That seems like a huge number, but it makes sense. If we have 7 wholes and we're splitting each one into 100 little tiny pieces, I'm going to end up with way more pieces. Now, it's sad because if I'm only getting 1/100th of a brownie, that's a really small amount, but it makes sense that my answer is getting bigger. All right. It is always so good to be able to draw pictures to prove it, but it does take a little bit of extra time. If you are ever feeling stuck, going back and drawing it out is always a great strategy, but we are going to try some now where we can see, can we actually do this just by comparing it to a whole without having to draw it out. Again, some of you may be noticing some patterns about the decimal point, and your minds may already be starting to think about place value and what you know, which is really cool. And we will be learning some even faster ways of dividing these. But right now, we are really focusing on how we can compare this to one whole based on the number of hundredths and tenths that we see. All right, let's keep going. All right, we're ready for a little bit more practice. Find some room on your scrap paper. What we're going to do for each problem is we are going to be rewriting each expression as a division sentence with a fraction divisor. Remember, the divisor is the number you are dividing by, and then we'll fill in the blanks. Let's take a look at the example. For example, if we had 2 divided by 1/10, our first step would be to rewrite it as 2 divided by 1/10 as a fraction. I'm not going to fill in my answer yet. Then I would ask myself, well, how many tenths are in one whole? Okay, I know there's 10 tenths in one whole, which means there must be 20 tenths in 2 wholes. To get from 1 to 2, I have to multiply by 2, so I would multiply that 10 by 2 to get me to 20. That's how I got to my answer. 2 divided by 1/10 is 20. Let's take a look at A and B together. I want you to look at them up here, and then I'll show you how you can write this on your scrap paper. All right, looking at question A. Go ahead and write on your scrap paper 5 divided by 1/10. Our first problem. All right, now let's set it up with an equal sign and go ahead and rewrite it for me as a fraction. All right, so we look at it rewritten as a fraction. 5 divided by 1/10. We're just asking ourselves how many tenths are there in 5 wholes. Now, we could draw it out if we needed to. We could draw out our 5 wholes and split each one into tenths and count them all. But to do it a little bit faster, let's see if we can fill in these blanks. There are blank tenths in one whole, so there are blank tenths in 5 wholes. To write this out, you can just write blank tenths, 1 whole, blank tenths, 5 wholes. And go ahead and fill them in. This how many tenths in 1 whole should start to become so fast and automatic. How many tenths in 1 whole? 10 tenths in 1 whole, 10 tenths in 1 whole, 10 tenths in 1 whole. All right, you got that? And write that down there, 10 tenths in 1 whole. We've already proven how we know that is true. So how many tenths in 5 wholes? I picture my 5 wholes drawn out with 10 in each one. 10 times 5, of course, we know. Go ahead and fill in how many tenths in 5 wholes. Perfect. You guys are exactly right. There are 50 tenths in 5 wholes, which means my answer to the problem of 5 divided by 1/10, rewritten as a fraction, 5 divided by 1/10 is, in fact, 50. Nice work. Let's try part B. Go ahead and write down the division equation. And then rewrite it as a fraction. You can set up your paper just to make it a little bit shorter. Blank tenths in 1 hole, blank tenths in 8 holes. Take 30 more seconds to finish it up. All right, let's check it. 8 divided by 1/10, we should have rewritten that as 8 divided by 1/10. That's just a reminder that I'm asking myself how many tenths are in those 8 holes. I can visualize exactly what 1/10 looks like. I can picture my 8 holes, my 8 pans of brownies, each one cut into tenths. How many pieces would that be? How many tenths in 1 hole? 10 tenths in 1 hole. Should have already filled that in. So how many tenths in 8 holes? 80 tenths in 8 holes. So our answer to 8 divided by 1/10 is 80. If you get stuck and need to draw it out by drawing out your 8 holes, and splitting each one into tenths, to remind yourself that, oh yeah, if I want to count all the tenths, there are 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80. There are 80 tenths in those 10 holes, but we should be getting close to a point where we don't need this picture anymore. Use it if you get stuck. All right, 2 to try on your own. You should know exactly how to set up your paper. You are trying C and D on your own. All right, if you need any help getting it set up on your paper, this is what mine looks like. Go ahead and take about 1 more minute and 30 seconds to finish filling them in. Don't forget, you're also writing it as a fraction. All right, take 10 more seconds. All right, it's okay if you're not done. Let's see what we got. Let's go back to this problem right here. 5 2/10 divided by 1/10. I remember that I'm rewriting it as division with a fraction, only turning my divisor into a fraction. So you should have written 5 2/10 divided by 1/10. Just a reminder that we're asking ourselves how many tenths can fit inside that 5 2/10. All right, how many tenths in 5 holes? We should be getting nice and fast at this. If there's 10 tenths in 1 hole, 50 tenths in 5 holes. Starting to do some of that math a little bit faster. How many tenths and 2/10? This is that one that sounds like a trick question, but it's actually not. How many tenths and 2/10? 2/10 and 2/10. Which means I need to figure out, well, how many tenths are in 5 and 2/10? 5 and 2/10 have a total of 50 plus 2, or 52 tenths. So our answer, of course, is 52. If you got to an answer of 52 for 5 and 2/10 divided by 1/10, nice work. Give yourself a smiley face. All right. Let's take a look at the second problem, checking what you have. I'm going to rewrite it as a fraction. 8 and 7/10 divided by 1/10. 8 and 7/10 divided by 1/10. I only rewrote my divisor as a fraction. All right, how many tenths and 8 wholes? 80 tenths and 8 wholes. How many tenths and 7/10? 7 tenths and 7/10. And so, how many tenths in 8 and 7/10? Well, here's my 8 wholes and 7/10, which means I have a total of 87 tenths. So an answer of 87. Again, of course, my answers are getting larger. When we divide by a fraction or a decimal number smaller than 1, my answer is going to be bigger because we're taking our wholes and we're cutting them into a bunch of little pieces. Looks like nobody really needed to draw a picture, but if you ever do not be shy about drawing your 5 wholes and 2 extra tenths, splitting them up into tenths, and figuring out how much you have. All right, if you crushed this one and got an answer of 87, nice work. Give yourself a big check. All right, so we're crushing it with the tenths. Now let's take a look at some problems. These are going to go into the hundreds. So find some space on your paper. I need a new piece. All right, let's take a look. Now we have 5 divided by 100. And we're going to be filling in how many hundredths in 1 whole, how many hundredths in 5 wholes. Go ahead and write this down on your paper. Don't forget to write the division equation. Notice it is 100th. All right, if you want to see how I set mine up on my scrap paper, this is what it looks like. Go ahead and take 1 more minute. Okay, let's check in and see what we got. 5 divided by 100th is just the same as 5 divided by 100th. We are acing this, rewriting our decimals as fractions. How many hundredths in 1 whole? Well, just like we know there's 10 tenths in 1 whole, we know that there's 100 hundredths in 1 whole. So then how many hundredths in 5 wholes? 500 hundredths in 5 wholes. I just multiplied by 5. I can picture my 5 whole pans of brownies, each one cut into pieces the size of 100th. That would be a total of 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 pieces. So 5 divided by 100th is in fact 500. All right, last one. 8 divided by 100. We rewrote that as a fraction. How many hundredths in one whole? 100 hundredths in one whole. So 800 hundredths in 8 wholes for a total of 800. Nice work. Okay, we got 2 more to try before you get to try some on your own. Before we try the last 2, which are the toughest of the bunch today, I do need to just tell you a little bit more about Watson. So Watson has lots of hobbies, as you guys have seen. He likes to spend his time eating ice cream cake. He likes to watch Peppa Pig. But I told you yesterday, I only let him watch a little bit of TV. And so he needs to play outside. So after school every day, what Watson really likes to do the best is he really likes to jump on the trampoline. That's his favorite activity to do. We have one of those, actually, those like really big high trampolines. So he gets up there, he can jump surprisingly high, and he just loves bouncing on the trampoline. He jumps and he jumps and he jumps. He even knows how to do some flips and some tricks. Pretty cool. So what does Watson like to do after school? Well, he likes to jump on the trampoline. If you're worried you might forget that, this is a great thing to just write down in your notes. You have all of your math here, so you can use this when you're doing your independent practice. I would just write down that Watson likes to jump on the trampoline. This is also a great time to make sure you're spelling everything correctly. And so I might even just go to my notes and just write down, what do we learn about Watson? He likes to jump on He likes to jump on the trampoline. This way, I make sure that I spelled everything correctly so I know exactly what it is Watson likes to do. Yeah, after school, that's what he loves to do, is jump on the trampoline. He wants to be able to jump high enough to then jump from the trampoline into the pool, but I didn't think that was a very good idea, so I told him he could not do that. All right, 2 more problems to go, and then you have some to try on your own. All right, these last 2. Go ahead and find some room on your paper, and let's write down our division equation. All right, looking at just letter G, this is how I set mine up. I'm looking at 5 2/10, but I want to know how many hundredths that is. So I can rewrite it as division using a fraction. I know in order for me to figure this out, I'm going to need to know how many hundredths are in 5 wholes, and then how many hundredths are in 2/10. I told you this one was going to be a little bit tricky. Make sure you have your paper set up, and we'll talk through this one a little bit together. Let's start with the hundredths in 5 wholes. This one we already know. There's 500 hundredths in 5 wholes. But how many hundredths in 2/10? Don't get tricked. There's not 2 hundredths in 2/10. There's 2/10 in 2/10. But if I were going to draw it out, here's my tenth, so here's 2/10. But if I divide this whole thing into hundredths, which is a little hard to see, there's actually 20 tenths. I'm sorry, there's actually 20 hundredths in those 2 tenths. And so if we want to know how many hundredths are in 5 and 2 tenths, there's actually 520 hundredths in 5 and 2 tenths. Again, some of you may be noticing something about the decimal point, some pretty cool patterns we're going to take a look at tomorrow. Let's try one more. Go ahead and set up your paper. 8 and 7 tenths divided by 100. This is what mine looks like when I have it set up. Go ahead and take 1 minute to solve on your own. All right, let's take a look at how we wrote it as a fraction. As a fraction, this would be 8 and 7 tenths divided by 100. How many hundredths in 8 wholes? 800 hundredths in 8 wholes. And the trickier part, how many hundredths in 7 tenths? Well, it's not just 7 hundredths in 7 tenths, it's actually 70 hundredths in 7 tenths. So if you got an answer of 870 hundredths in 8 and 7 tenths, you are exactly correct. And if you got that exactly correct, I want you to draw a really quick picture of Watson jumping on his trampoline. Excuse me. I'm not the best drawer either. That's okay. Draw however you can. Excuse me. All right, I want you to take a quick look at what you're going to be doing today in your independent practice because it's going to look a little bit different. Today, when you are done watching this video and you have practiced solving these problems along with me, your independent practice today is going to look a little bit more like this. The directions are that you need to rewrite each expression as a division sentence with a fraction divisor and then fill in the blanks. So if you look at this very first example, and I'll put this in your independent practice as well, if the problem were 4 divided by 1/10, you would rewrite that as 4 divided by 1/10. Now, I'm not going to have you type the fractions into the computer, but this is what you should be doing on your scrap paper. You would then be able to fill in the blanks. There are 10 tenths in 1 whole, so there are 40 tenths in 4 wholes. When you open up your independent practice, it's going to look a little bit like this, and it's going to ask you to fill in the blanks. So you will need to use your scrap paper, as always, to rewrite it as a fraction, and then you're going to be typing in the numbers that go in. There are tenths in 1 whole. There are tenths in 9 wholes. I am going to ask that you put a comma in between your numbers to separate them. There's more directions about that once you open the independent practice. And so if you were answering question number 1, you would type it in. Let's see, there's 10 tenths in 1 whole or 40 tenths in 4 wholes. So when you write it out, it would look a little bit like this, 10, 40. And that way I can see the 2 numbers that you need. Just a little bit different today. As always, if you have any questions about the independent practice, please make sure you are coming to office hours at 3:15. Please continue checking your grades to see if you have any missing assignments and to just see how well you are doing. Really nice work on multiplying decimals. We're going to be working on dividing decimals for the next couple days, the rest of this week, and then test next week. Exciting stuff. All right, nice work, scholars. Cannot wait to see how your independent practice turns out.